Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. St. Luke was not one of the apostles, as you may know. St. Paul calls him, I think in the book of Colossians, his physician. What that actually meant in the first century, I'm not quite sure. I don't think we want to say it meant what it does today. On the other hand, I think it would be stretching it to say that Luke was probably a person concerned about detail and accuracy. He certainly is a very good writer. You have to take my word for this. His Greek is very good Greek. Unlike Mark, which is very simplistic Greek, we have people speak English the same way today. Luke's is very complicated, tough to translate, long run-on sentences with very complex syntax. He wrote 2 books, actually, I think almost a third of the New Testament, when you think about it. His Gospel, I think, is the longest one, St. Luke's Gospel. He includes all kinds of stories that were missed in the other Gospels. He has more stories about women and children than any of the other Gospels. On that great text we heard in the baptism service that they let the little children constantly, it's St. Luke who clarifies that, perhaps in anticipation of certain issues that might arise in the future, uses the Greek word graphoi, which translates into English as sucking, nursing infants. They weren't just bringing 7- and 8-year-old kids to Jesus, they were bringing nursing infants. And that's why the disciples said, get these children out of here. So this idea that we should not bring our infants to Jesus, by the way we bring them to Jesus today is in the waters of baptism. Jesus is not here physically anymore. If he were, we wouldn't need baptism. So that we bring our children, our infants to Jesus certainly is permitted, in fact encouraged by the Lord himself, who actually says, unless you all become as these little infants, you will not get into the kingdom of God. And he's not meaning we have to be naive like babies. That's not the point. The point, I think, quite obviously is we must understand ourselves before God to be as helpless as a nursing infant, as dependent on nourishment from our father, in this case, as we are our mother, for life. Okay, does it make sense? That's what he means. Luke is also the one who includes, the only one who includes the details of the birth story. That one of the story we hear at Christmas Eve, the shepherds and so on, that is only in Luke's Gospel. He makes it very clear in the introduction to his book of St. Luke that many have tried to set their hand to write an account of the things that happened among us. And so I want to check it all out and write for you an orderly account so that you may be certain of the things that you believe. There's a critical word, certain. And our certainty, folks, is as, we say a certain. Our certainty is as certain as the record, the written record, is accurate. Did that make sense? Do you understand what I said? Our certainty of our faith will be as solid and certain as is the accuracy of the written record. Because God no longer works through visions and dreams and signs. He works through the written record. So as I've been telling my adult instruction class every Monday night, or reminding them off and on, when we run into miracle stories like the virgin birth, the resurrection, and so on, the wrong question to ask is, do things like this happen? Because they don't. We're not stupid. The right question is, did these things happen? And is there any good evidence for them? Does the record stand the test? Luke, very interestingly too, runs a great risk in a certain sense, which the Quran does not do. Most other religious myths and records don't do. And that is that he ties the story of salvation into historical events. And what is the risk in doing so? That if you make a mistake in your history lesson, it calls into question the entire story of the gospel. Do you understand that? One particular troubling case is the story of the Christmas story, where St. Luke says that a fellow named Quirinius was governor of Syria at the time of Jesus' birth. The record tells us that Quirinius was not governor at that time. He was governor later. Many have jumped on that and said, see, St. Luke messed up here. Now, that's a little bit arrogant to think that a fellow living at that time would be so ignorant of an event that important, the governor of Syria. He made that kind of an obvious, glaring mistake, which would not have been corrected by anybody at that time. The fact of the matter is, it depends on how you translate the text. Some of you remember this at Christmas time, I go through the story. It could be translated, not this happened while Quirinius was governor, but it could be translated, he was, this happened while Quirinius was governing, which doesn't mean he had officially been made governor yet. He was kind of serving in that capacity temporarily and did such a good job that Caesar officially appointed him later. That could be one translation. Another possible translation of that text I've read could be, this happened before Quirinius was governor of Syria, which would of course clear up the problem too. So there are ways to handle the issue. But I think it is interesting that St. Luke does not let the Christian story float out there like that balloon that floated out of Colorado with that kid was supposed to be in it. Did you hear that story? Well, whatever, we won't comment on that. But the gospel does not float out there in midair somewhere without being tethered, tied to historical events, which takes a big risk for Christianity. And other religions don't do that because they're obviously mythological. I think that's important to remember. Luke also wrote a second book, as you are aware. Book 2 was the book of the Acts of the Apostles, in which he goes through the history of the early church. And ends it with St. Paul. I forget what chapter this takes up, but Luke changes from third person, he, talk about Paul, to first person plural, we. Which the obvious conclusion is that Luke now began accompanying St. Paul. I think it was on his third missionary journey, if I remember correctly. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was his third one. Paul, we know, did have some medical problem. He calls it a thorn in the flesh, which got in the way of his ministry a little bit. We don't know what it was. Was it malaria? Was it weak vision? Some have thought that. Was it something else? Who knows? And Luke apparently accompanies Paul to help him as his personal physician and becomes his stenographer. Does that make sense? The one who takes notes and writes an orderly account, and perhaps even in some cases wrote down some of the epistles, and Paul may have dictated them to him. We don't know for sure on that. So Luke is a very critical individual in the history of the Christian church. His gospel and his history book, the Acts of the Apostles, stand on the authority, therefore, of St. Paul. And the early church was very cautious. They would not accept any writing as being New Testament scripture, which could not be proven or demonstrated that it had been written or had the authority of an eyewitness standing behind it, which was a problem for Mark's gospel and Luke's. Mark's gospel, of course, the tradition of the early church, is a very solid tradition, is that St. Peter stands behind Mark's gospel. There's a lot of evidence for that. St. Luke, of course, the tradition was, and again, it's a very strong tradition, that St. Paul the Apostle stands behind it. By the way, St. Luke's gospel also is the only gospel that tells a lot of stories about a doctrine or a topic that was very close to St. Paul's heart. And what was that? A word that pops in his book all the time. And Luther rediscovers the truth of this critical doctrine from reading the book of Romans. What is that doctrine? Justification by faith alone. How are we declared innocent before God? That was the issue of the Reformation, wasn't it? Which will be the issue next Sunday. We're celebrating the Reformation. How is a person justified before God? By faith and love, or by faith alone? Luther's obviously was faith alone. And it is St. Luke in his gospel records that beautiful story of the Pharisee and the publican. That's only in Luke's gospel. Where the Pharisee points to his good deeds of love for people, and how the publican, tax collector, the outcast in society, prays out in the corner of the temple, strikes his chest as a sign of grief, and says, God, well, I might translate this very literally, God be propitiated to me. He's in the temple, probably the evening or morning sacrifice. He's just seen the lamb butchered on the altar. And that's what that word means, be propitiated to me, not be merciful to me. That's the English translation. This is the point. Be propitious to me. In other words,